Have you ever seen an Unplace room? Even if you say no, I think you'd be mistaken. Maybe you just didn't know what it was you saw. Maybe you think it's just your mind playing tricks on you. Maybe you just imagined it all. Well, you didn't. The first place I saw an Unplace room, I was a little boy, maybe 10, accompanying my father to the butcher's shop. We were getting steaks for dinner, and when the butcher wrapped up our order, I saw it. The Unplace room. The door to the back room was open just slightly, and I curiously peeked over the counter to get a better look. Now, I only glanced briefly because the sight made me stumble back in fear, but I'm sure to this day that it was real. Several skinless bodies hanging from the ceiling, species unrecognizable. They could have been pigs, or dogs, or humans. Maggots were crawling, feasting on the flesh, and I could clearly make out a distinct sound of static coming from the door. When the first shot cleared, and I looked again, the room was different. There were bodies hanging from the hooks, sure, but they were clearly pigs, and there were no maggots, and there was no static. I had nightmares about that room for weeks, but at some point, I just forgot all about it, until it happened again. This time, I was at the dentist for a checkup. There was an x-ray room at the back of my dentist office. A small room, barely enough space to contain the chair you'd sit in. The dentist had just finished with me and was about to give me some random knick-knack as a prize. Loitering about, waiting, I caught movement in my peripheral vision and turned my gaze to the open room at the back, catching a glimpse of a tall, thin, humanoid shadow darting from the edge of the doorway, slipping through the open door. I stared at the room nervously, not quite sure what I'd seen, and I could hear that crackling static noise growing louder. My dentist didn't seem to notice anything at all, and I quickly grabbed my prize and got out of there. The third time it happened was several years later. I'd almost forgotten about the incidents by then, although they would still pop up in the odd nightmare every now and again. I was on my way to the mall after school, running to catch up with my friends who had left a few minutes earlier. As I was passing a particularly dark alley, I suddenly stopped dead in my tracks. A dissonant hum emanated from the darkness of it, and I felt chills run down my spine as I started to remember. I slowly turned my head, dreading what I'd see. A wall of static, like a signalless TV, seemed to fill the alleyway. It crackled erratically, but every once in a while, I could clearly make out shapes in the chaotic pattern. Tall, thin, humanoid shapes. I got out of there as fast as I could when I heard the wailing noises. Here's the thing about the Unplace rooms. Sometimes they'll just be there. No horrible visions, no static, no shadows, but you can still sense that something is wrong. Like there's something that just doesn't belong. Something just a little bit off. You'll pass a house at dusk with stairs going down to the basement, and you'll notice that the light of the wall lantern flickers at insane intervals. Or pass an open classroom in a high school after hours, imagining for a brief second that something lurks within them. Or suddenly being alone in a large supermarket, wondering where all the people went. Passing notions, like they were never there to begin with. Like they were out of place. After the incident at the alley, I started seeing them almost every week. I think I always could see them, but now I was aware of them. A strange face in a passing car, a mad smile from an old lady upon passing her room in a retirement home, a vacant room in the hospital, just a little too filthy, strange instruments laid out on a carpet in the back room of a hairdresser's, an elevator that just hummed too weirdly, passing notions. Being aware of them now, I knew I had to avoid them at all cost. But I would still seek them out, just to observe. Not for long, and not directly. Instead, I would focus on other people as they interacted in and around the rooms. I quickly saw a pattern. Kids and young adults would instinctively avoid them, showing signs of distress, and in some cases, primal fear. Adults would ignore them, or not notice them at all. Elderly people seemed to be drawn to them, but never showed any signs of knowing they were there. I recorded all the data I gathered meticulously in notebooks, several shelves worth at this point. I was nearing my late teens, and the Unplace room took up more or less all my time at this point. I had no friends anymore. I was just that weird kid, always lurking around, writing in his notebook. My grades had dropped, and I hardly spoke to my parents anymore. I was seeing several counselors, but no one seemed to take me seriously. I was eventually diagnosed with a light version of schizophrenia, and after the initial therapy proved unsuccessful, I was prescribed various drugs. I'd take them just to keep my parents off my back, but they offered no help. The Unplaced rooms were still there. I'd see them in our house, in our neighbor's house, in school, everywhere I went. Not daily, but sooner or later they'd show up somewhere, out of place. I had figured out how people reacted to them, but I had yet to discover why. My hypothesis was that the phenomenon was somehow connected to death, based on how the different age groups interacted around them. But there was more than that, or maybe less. After a few years, I was able to spot the pattern. Hope, or lack thereof. The rooms seemed to manifest in places where desperation or hopelessness reigned. There would be times where they simply wouldn't fit this pattern, a statistical anomaly. But at this point, I really felt I was onto something, so I disregarded this notion. A bad mistake. I was clinically depressed during this period. I'd barely graduated school, but was in no shape to attend college. So I was working dead-end jobs, still living with my parents, my life more or less in shambles. No friends, no social life. My days spent hunting the rooms, nights browsing obscure web forums looking for answers. My notebooks digitized. I now had several hard drives packed full with data, of which I would share diligently with anonymous internet strangers. But they were hobbyists. They didn't devote their life to the cause, like me. One evening, after working a lengthy shift at my current dead-end job, I was walking to my car, a crappy old white Toyota, when I didn't notice the Unplace room's presence. As mentioned earlier, I'd come to the conclusion that they would only manifest in rooms of hopelessness or despair, but that wasn't quite accurate. So I wasn't aware of the way the car smelled slightly different, or the buzzing static sound emanating from the speakers, or the tall, thin, humanoid shadow lurking in my back seat. I opened the door, got in, inserted the key, and turned the ignition. And only when the sound of my engine was replaced by dissonant static, I realized I was in trouble. It was then I saw the thin, red, veiny hand slowly reaching for my right shoulder. I let out a high-pitched wail and fumbled the car door open with my left hand and bolted away as fast as my legs could muster. I didn't look back. I dared not, and just ran to the closest building around, my dead-end burger joint workplace. Without thinking, without being aware, I quickly dove in the front door and hid behind the first and best table I could find. My heart was racing. I was hyperventilating uncontrollably, and I could not bring myself to move an inch. I sat there several minutes before I noticed it. There was no one around. Not a single person anywhere. I was sure at least a couple of tables were occupied when I left. And even if not, there should at least be someone manning the register. There wasn't. And the lights were different. It was like they were dimmed somehow, but also like they shone wrong. Like there was an eerie film somehow filtering every light particle. I clung to the walls as I crawled around the restaurant, daring a peek out the windows every once in a while. The car lot looked empty, the streets as well. I needed to get someplace public, fast. And the most public place I could think of was the supermarket just down the street. If I ran at full capacity, it wouldn't take me more than a minute. I decided to risk it. This place was just too strange, and it felt weird for all the wrong reasons. I bolted out the door much in the same manner I dove in, and legged it down the street, casting fearful glances over my shoulder every few seconds. I couldn't see anything, but I kept the pace up regardless. As I rounded the corner, I saw the supermarket just down the street, lights still on. Good. There had to be people there. It wasn't that late yet. I was completely exhausted at this point, and the adrenaline rush was wearing off. When I got to the entrance, glancing back as I did, I allowed myself to slow down. I should be safe now. Drenched in sweat, I pushed through the revolving door, only to find my worst fears come true. The place was empty. I stood, terror-struck, staring into what appeared to me as miles upon miles of empty aisles. The dim light eerily filtered, bathing everything in a constant sepia-like hue. I've never felt more removed from reality than in that exact moment, and a sense of utter hopelessness came over me. But I couldn't give in to it. I knew that much. Not sure what to do next, I just walked into the supermarket, browsing the tall shelves nervously. Nothing made sense. There were groceries and canned food and milk cartons and everything you'd expect. But they were all the wrong colour, and the labels were gibberish. I stumbled around disoriented for a few minutes before I saw it. It had entered soundlessly through the revolving doors and was moving erratically in short bursts of insane speed. Then it would pause for a few moments and just sort of flicker in and out of existence before moving again. The Unman. I don't know what else to call it. In many ways, it was just like us. Bipedal, five-fingered, five-toed, neck, head, mouth, two-eyed. But the dimensions were all off. Too thin, too tall. But what really disturbed me, to the point of near madness, was its skin. It was a deep shade of red, pulsating black veins running everywhere. Large, fleshy sacs hung from it, like it was wearing its internal organs on the outside. External organs. The gaping mouth and deep sunken eyes were engulfed by flickering static fields, spewing out dissonant sounds echoing through the vastness of the supermarket. I stood, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. I had no way of telling how its senses worked, if it could see, hear, both or neither. but I knew I could not stay. I had to move. I had to get out. I slowly moved behind one of the massive shelves, never taking my eyes off the thing. It kept shifting erratically about, as if trying to ascertain something. Ascertain me. I crept along the shelves, carefully, inching my way towards the exit. It was taking ages, but there was no discernible alternative. I could hear the creature, the unman, as the static echoed around me. But I kept my distance as best I could. I could see the exit now, just a matter of seconds. That's when I saw her, the unwoman. Much like her assumed mate, she moved erratically in short bursts of unnatural speed, flickering in and out of existence. Much like her assumed mate, there hung bags of flesh, organs, loosely on a red, veined body. Much like her assumed mate, she was looking for me. I froze again, caught dead center between the two repugnant abominations. I still had no way if that even helped, if they relied on sound or movement to maneuver around. But as I, terrified beyond words, assessed my situation, I felt total hopelessness and despair, like a black hole had opened under me, and there was no escaping it. And in that instant, both of them, the unman and unwoman, instantly turned to face me, their static screams rising to deafening volumes. And it suddenly dawned on me on how they were tracking me. I had no choice at the moment. I had to run. They'd both sensed my despair, and I knew deep down that they could rip me to shreds in seconds if I didn't move. Or worse, take their time with me, enjoy their date night to the fullest. I somehow got to the exit before the unwoman, her shifting presence blinking in and out like static lightning behind me. The unman trailed just behind. They were much faster than me, and the little head start I had wouldn't last me long. I needed a way out of there. Fast. Running blindly down the street, the piercing wails of static so intense I was bleeding from my ears, I found a sort of peace I hadn't felt before. A certainty of something. Death, maybe. Somehow, this feeling, this promised death, soothed me, gave me hope. And as soon as I let the sensation overcome me, the static noise stopped. I continued running for 5 minutes before daring to slow down, and finally stopped completely. They couldn't sense me now. My hope, however fleeting, gave me some form of protection. I realized then how I could get out, how I could get home. These things were the antithesis of hope. They entered our world through the darkest corners of our reality, the places and people devoid of hope and light. They didn't need much, just a fleeting perception of hopelessness, and they were there. Just a little depression, a little sorrow, a little regret, and they would climb through and grab you. I started running then, knowing exactly where I had to be, where my portal was, just a little further down the street. The last place I can remember feeling nothing but joy. I was 5, and my mother had just dropped me off to kindergarten. I felt safe there. I laughed there. I looked forward to going there. And I needed that feeling again. I kicked open the doors, and as my foot crossed the threshold, a feeling of utter joy and hope struck me hard. I fell to my knees, rubbing my eyes. When I opened them again, I was back in my car in the parking lot of my workplace. I turned around in fear, expecting the unman to still be there, but to my relief, it wasn't. I flung open the door and ran into the restaurant, only to find a handful of mildly surprised people enjoying their burgers. I fell to my knees, laughing, pounding on the floor. One of my co-workers had to escort me home because she thought I was on some sort of hallucinogenic drug or something. I hope you take my tale to heart. I still see them, the Unplace rooms, and so will you now. Those vacant places that just doesn't feel right, that flickering light in your neighbour's basement, the empty aisles of the supermarket, that back room at your doctor's office where the light just seems a bit off. You know the places. You've seen them. Think about me when you feel hope slipping and that dark, ugly feeling of despair overcome you. Be aware of the rooms, especially then, because if you don't, you might just unknowingly step into an unplaced room. And if you do, God help you.